While the Revolutionary War would end with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the American Revolution as a political and social movement would continue for decades to come. The war did not suddenly and violently overturn the way that politics and society ran in the colonies. The Declaration of Independence did not forge a kind of union of territories under a central and powerful government. As we've talked about in class, really the division of the states continued, and most of the former colonists, now Americans, turned to their state governments as the or most influential level of government. In this chapter, we're going to be dedicated to studying the evolution of the American government following the Declaration of Independence, based upon diverse political values and shifting political needs of these new independent states. So we can see cotton looms in this picture. And as we learned in the last unit, most manufacturing, including the manufacturing of textiles, had been done in Great Britain. And that will continue to be the case. But of course, with the dawn of the American Revolution, the need to be more self-sufficient with manufactured goods did create a new and developing industrial center in the United States. It's always difficult to set up a new government, and it's even more difficult when the attempt is to set up a new type of government. When the Second Continental Congress declared independence in 1776, the colonies were thrust into a type of state of nature where no official law existed. Before the revolution was even won, they needed to establish a new type of government that was based on these ideas of republicanism. It would govern independent states if they survived the war. Independence untethered the American states from England, and with this mass exodus of conservative Tory loyalists, so you think about the people who were satisfied with the way that the British ran their government and wanted the stability and security of being part of the English system, it meant that the course of the American Revolution would be steered by the political objectives of liberal patriots, and not those that would have turned to England as their model for new government. While the war united patriots in the common cause for independence, disagreement and self-interest once again defined how former colonies interacted with one another when it came to creating constitutions. So in other words, while we have 13 independent states, 13 independent countries, all working for the common goal of independence, their ideas about what government should look like. And if you think about the functions of government, security, economic leadership, and the protection and establishment of certain rights, if you think about those functions, each of the states had a different idea of what that should look like. Typically, conservatives, we're talking about liberals and conservatives focus on maintaining the status quo, using older models in order to maintain structure and stability for the way that things have been. When the Tories were removed from the equation, it meant that liberals, people that want to push proactively more economic and social equality, or bring about change within the government system, it meant that liberal patriots, people that were in support of the independence movement and in support of adopting more Republican ideas, those people are going to be the ones who really steer the ship during and after the revolution. Okay, it's really important to start thinking about conservatism versus liberalism because we're having a pendulum effect. So we're moving from very conservative, old-fashioned European style to a liberal, brand new Republican style. And during the Articles of Confederation, then, that kind of Republican excess for the people, by the people will have its shortcomings. And we're going to see then another swing back towards a conservative, more centralized, stable government approach. There has to be a balance between the will of the people and structure and stability of government authority. Upon declaring independence, the Continental Congress called on the former colonies to draft new state constitutions that would embody the Republican values that were championed in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Governments that get their power from the consent of the governed, and whose purpose was to protect the natural rights of its citizens. As free and independent states, legislative bodies were free to go about their task as they saw fit. Some states like Rhode Island and Connecticut simply retouched their existing colonial charters. If you recall, Rhode Island from the very beginning was pretty liberal and more democratic, less aristocratic than other New England states. So their constitution after the Revolution was more of a tweak than it was an overhaul. In other cases, states like Massachusetts would begin from scratch. At every turn, new states were creating new precedents that would be shaping the constitution of the federal government when it came time to deal with the problems the Articles of Confederation caused. For example, Massachusetts used a constitutional convention to draft a written governing charter. This is a real break from the English tradition. In Great Britain, a constitution was more of a legal precedent. They don't have a written constitution as we do. Instead, they rely on following tradition. And so through hundreds of years of legal tradition and multiple legal documents, that's how the colonists and Englishmen came to understand what their rights and responsibilities are and what government should do and shouldn't do. But it's really not written down in one place. Massachusetts takes the step to having a constitution writing convention where they're actually going to write a formal charter for what the role of government is, what the role of the citizens are, and what rights are protected for those citizens. And so our understanding of what a constitution is and should be really begins here with this history. So at this assembly, lawmakers gathered to write out the rules, the functions, the limitations of government. And before the Constitution could be adopted, it had to be ratified or accepted by the people whom it governed. Then and only then could the Constitution be changed if citizens demanded another constitutional convention. So we can see how Massachusetts really created a model for what we have today. Laws come and go with simple majorities, but in order to adopt or change our Constitution through the amendment process, there really needs to be a supermajority, and it's a two-part process where it starts with lawmakers, members of Congress, supporting an amendment with a supermajority, but it ends with the people of the states or the states themselves ratifying and saying, yes, we need to make these changes to the most important part of our government's founding documents. This has only occurred on a rare occasion. Right now, there are 27 amendments to our Constitution. So consider that compared to the hundreds of proposals. It's very uncommon for a Constitution to change, even over a period of hundreds of years. While each of the 13 states was an independent, autonomous country, they did share certain features in common. These were especially important concerning the government. Like Massachusetts, each state ended up writing a constitution. These constitutions broke away from England in a number of respects. First of all, as written documents instead of unwritten common law or tradition. These documents were supposed to represent a fundamental law, or a law above the law, a guiding principle for how government ought to operate or has to run, the rights and responsibilities of the people as well. These would all be superior to the ordinary legislation process, as I had mentioned before. Most states included a Bill of Rights that protected the liberties of the people from legislative encroachment, or the concern that at the whim of the people, the rights of the minority could be stripped away. And so, depending on the state, protections for free speech, religious liberty, protection of criminal rights like habeas corpus, or protection from search and seizure, those types of rights are written out explicitly so that the people know and the government know there are certain protections that cannot be infringed solely because it's convenient for the government to do so. This idea of republicanism, the spirit of for the people, by the people, state governments invested a tremendous amount of power in the legislative branches. As a check on that legislative power, the importance of reoccurring elections and making lawmakers accountable to the people was something that was reflected in term limits and regular elections. Annual elections once a year meant that lawmakers almost had to continuously be campaigning and in touch with their constituents. All of the colonies also afraid and disenchanted with the executive power of a monarchy and the experience they had under the royal courts, all created weak executive and judicial branches. So really limiting the influence of colonial governors and colonial courts. Even though this system was moving in a very democratic direction, the type of control and law enforcement and executive functions that had been responsible for the stability of the British Empire was sacrificed in the process because of the tyranny that England had used. Here's your section recap. So as we've talked about, the Declaration of Independence did not create one United States of America. It created 13 independent countries united in a common cause. Though they were united in the movement for a war for independence, and they were united in these ideas of republicanism, that is, that a government gets its authority from the will of its people, they were divided on exactly what that should look like. So each of the 13 governments set up something that reflected their own interests and values and the needs of their states at that time. There were important elements, though, as far as what they had in common. First of all, they created drafted constitutions, written constitutions, as opposed to following the old unwritten form of constitution making that England had created. These written constitutions would act as a guiding set of principles for how government runs, for the rights of the people, and the responsibilities of citizens as far as what their civic duties, civic responsibilities would be. The other thing that they had in common was the sense that they wanted to avoid a central authority, whether that was a central authority over all 13 states, or whether it was an investment in a strong executive branch at the local level. They really weakened executive and judicial function in that capacity. While this led to greater democratization, participation in the government by the average person, at least white males, and property requirements are diminishing, It also meant that things weren't necessarily stable in these early state governments, that a lack of an executive and a lack of a central authority meant that law interpretation and law enforcement oftentimes ran amok. We're going to see these issues continue to play out in another section here as we talk about the governing charter over the 13 states, which became known as the Articles of Confederation. With a weak executive, it's going to mean weak law enforcement, weak economy, and insecurity as far as threats from foreign nations and domestic affairs.